Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the third session of Eth.Sci 2021 on Science Communication, Public Trust and Expertise. I'm Sahana Rajan from Eth.Sci India Group, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. So let me start by shortly introducing our speakers to you. First, we have with us anthropologist Heidi Larson. She is the director of the Vaccine Confidence Project at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. This project broadly surveys the social, psychological, political, historical, and cultural factors that influence attitudes to vaccines. She is also author of the book Stuck: How Vaccine Rumors Start and Why They Don't Go Away. That was published in, I think, July 2020. That was right at the peak of the lockdown. So welcome, Heidi. And next, we have the philosopher Maya Goldenberg from University of Guelph. I learned how to say that, Guelph. I think I said it right. She is an associate professor in Department of Philosophy there, and her research focuses on medical epistemology and specifically addresses how knowledge claims come to be justified in healthcare. She has explored this question in the pressing context of evidence-based medicine and has now broadened the question to examine vaccine hesitancy. Thank you for joining us, Maya. And our third panel speaker is philosopher Tarun Menon. He is an assistant professor of philosophy at the School of Humanities in National Institute of Advanced Studies. His work focuses on the questions of causation and explanation in natural and social sciences, and on the social and ethical context of scientific research. Great to have you here, Tarun. And here to give us the on-the-ground reality check from an Indian perspective is science writer Rayies Altaf. He's an STS, Science and Technology Studies researcher and science writer. His areas of interest include science-society interaction, scientific research, ecology, environment, and sustainability. He recently finished his fellowship at TERI, New Delhi, in climate change communication in the Himalayas 2020, and is currently teaching at Delhi School of Journalism. Also, I would like to specially thank him for joining us on short notice. Thank you for being here, Rayies.
Thank you.
If you would like to know more about our panel speakers, we'll share a few links towards the end of our session, so you can feel free to check it out. Now, broadly, the structure of our session today is that we would have about an hour of discussion, and then we'll open the floor, the virtual floor, for questions and answers. During the discussion, I invite our audience to share their questions on the chat box. I'll do my best to weave it into the conversation, or else you can raise your hand, and I'll definitely call upon you during the question and answer session. Before we begin, I request everyone to mute their microphones, and we encourage you all to keep your video on if that suits you. Love to see some faces. And so yeah, let's get this rolling, guys, and have a bit of fun. So I'm going to start this by, let's start with, I thought we could begin by talking about the image of science during the pandemic. Throughout the pandemic situation, there has been a continuous flow of scientific claims, some of which have been proven false, while they have had tangible effects on the lives of the public. An instance would be the initial proposal of using hydroxychloroquine to treat coronavirus. So in this climate of continuous flux in scientific claims, when we take public healthcare decisions on the basis of these claims, there is a sense in which it is not possible to pin down the consequences that the policy decision would have, given that we don't really have complete information about the treatment, or in the current case, the vaccine. So I thought I could start by asking the philosophers on our dais, Maya and Tarun, what, in your perspective, is the most public-friendly way of understanding scientific facts, like facts and quotes, during this crisis situation? What is the picture of science that we would want to communicate to the public? You can raise your hand, and I can just, and then you can start. Tarun and Heidi. Yes, Maya, please.
What we saw during a sort of public response to changes in scientific claims, for example, when the WHO shifted on wearing masks in the community, was can be understood as an image of science that is widely held in the public that doesn't actually match what science looks like in practice. There's a sort of common view of science as a body of static facts. Things like the theory of gravity, very well established for sure. And so the expectation is that when scientists pronounce, they are speaking some kind of unshakable truth. So what we saw during the months and months of COVID was actually what science looks like when it is new, emergent, and because of that, it is uncertain, and it's going to shift as new evidence is going to be collected. So what the public saw was what science actually looks like before it gets established to anything like what you might call a fact. We can quibble about whether facts are ever static. I'd say they're not, but some are more established than others. So this was a case study in how the public responded to unsettled science, when it's new, when it's contested, and when it's emerging. So there were some responses saying, what do you mean they're changing their view on things like mask wearing? Surely that means the scientists don't know what they're talking about. But a better lesson for the public and for others would have been, this is what science looks like when we're still figuring it out. And it's a good sign when we shift our conclusions based on new evidence, rather than the other version is dogmatically adhere to a view, even when the evidence starts to contradict it.
Tarun, yes, please.
Yeah, so I basically agree with that. I think, so as Maya mentioned, I think one of the unique features of this pandemic has been that I think for the first time in my memory, at least, you have this many people paying attention to science happening in real time, right? As opposed to science as you see in textbooks, or as you see in TV shows or books about science. And so in some sense, the uncertainty that is characteristic of scientific investigation, that's characteristic of any process where you try to accumulate evidence, is highlighted when you're seeing that process happen, when you're tracking that process, seeing how opinions change. And while it is true that there are, a lot of the science we encounter otherwise is more established, maybe less uncertain, it's also true, I think, that a lot of the science we encounter otherwise is also uncertain, but we don't have to confront the uncertainty in the same way that we've had to do with COVID science. And I think there's an interesting problem or question regarding science communication here, because I think there's been maybe not an explicitly formulated view, but kind of an implicit idea among at least public science communicators, so sort of the public press and so on, where you present the results of science without focusing too much on uncertainty, the idea of how much, like what the error bars are on our claims, like how uncertain we are on a claim, what the alternative hypotheses are. And one potential reason for this, might just be that a lot of the people reporting either themselves aren't equipped to express this, or feel like this is not something that the readership would be interested in. But I think another reason is that there's also this suspicion that reporting uncertainty can actually be counterproductive. Often what you see, for example, in climate change, the discussions of climate change, is that denialists of climate change will jump on claims of uncertainty as a kind of evidence that the field of climate science itself is somehow not a proper science, or hasn't really settled on any conclusions, when really those kinds of expressions of uncertainty are par for the course in actual internal scientific communication, right? And so there's a worry, I think, that arisen in science communication, that maybe we don't want to emphasize this uncertainty, or we want to kind of brush it under the rug a little bit, because it could be perhaps misused by kind of bad faith actors or something like this. But I think what we're seeing now is one of the downsides of having that attitude, as Maya pointed out, which is that when you actually have a situation where the public is tracking science at real time, and if they're not accustomed to thinking of science as this process where there's uncertainties associated with the claims are open to revision, the actual practice of science involves constant revision of claims being accepted and then rejected, and so on. If the public isn't accustomed to thinking of science this way, then this whole process of, say, like the development of vaccines, or how we think about masks, even though I think in many ways this should be a story of the triumph of the scientific community, is seen as the scientific community just kind of flailing and not knowing what it's doing. So I think, maybe there's something misguided about this earlier idea of not presenting uncertainty as part of science.
Yes, Maya, please. Would you like to add?
I wanted to add, in full agreement with those comments, on top of the problem with trying to present science as certain, as Tarun mentioned, it creates this false image of science. And when we see that not happening, it creates a public concern. There's also been studies into, can the public handle uncertainty. That's been a big question. Is it wise to admit to uncertainty? Will it cause panic among the publics? And the research indicates yes. I mean, we deal with uncertainty every day. We make decisions under uncertainty in our everyday lives. So it is patronizing for sure to assume that the public can't handle the truth, when indeed there's a lot of suggestions coming through psychological research that they absolutely can. It of course needs to be communicated carefully, but the other version, as Tarun nicely explained, is the public gets into a panic every time there's a shift in policy.
That makes sense. I think that forms a really good background for the kind of question I wanted to ask, which is, so on this background of the kind of realistic image of science that we hope the public would possess, given the current situations about vaccines, this goes to Rayies. What do you feel, Rayies? What are the ways in which popular media, like news outlet, authoritative popular figures, how do they tend to trigger unrealistic expectations about science? Like, what are some of the classic missteps that science communities might make while talking about vaccines to the public?
Sahana, first of all, I will actually go back to what my esteemed speakers were actually talking about. So this uncertainty in sciences, and how public is public enough actually capable of dealing with it? Do they have the potential kind of things? So I think the two things which actually have happened because of this pandemic. So this was we were actually seeing, as Tarun said, science happening in front of us, the process is happening in front of us. So the people who actually had access to the scientific method and knowledge and awareness, for them it was actually a normal process, nothing problematic or nothing abnormal. So it was just as a normal thing, normal science happening in normal way. But for those people who actually don't have an idea, when I say about those people, actually I'm talking about grassroots level, the people who actually, there's a deficit of scientific information. They're actually not aware about what science actually is and how it works, what is the scientific method. For them actually, for that community, there was a kind of that faith was shaken. Oh, this is the science. This is how they work, scientific things and all that. So and that actually gave rise to a lot of misinformation and disinformation at the ground level. So yeah, given those two, actually, this pandemic, in fact, kind of produced two different images. One is in an image where people were saying, it's a normal science happening in a normal way, so nothing, abnormal about it. And another way is like, oh, this is a very, abnormal situation. So what we do, what should we do about it, and all those things. Yeah. Now coming back to this, when I actually talked about the misinformation or disinformation campaigns, you actually mentioned about role of media and all that. I think media has a terrific role to play in it, in the sense that not actually during pandemics only, but in normal times, because it's a question also about democratization of science, as Maya was actually mentioning. So we have a notion of actually this instrumental image of science, so technocratic image of science. So an instrumental rationality, meaning the facts speak themselves. So facts are neutral, and they are not subject laden and all that. There is no subjectivity within facts. So yeah, that's the truth. So which is not the case actually. The case is different. So yeah, I think in a way that media has a very vital role to play in democratization of science, opening up the space, where actually public can or public may get an access to the scientific, to the scientific process itself. But what I mean by that is, for example, the whole, the idea of the whole process of the efficacy of the vaccines, which we actually were talking about, because the data was not, being put up in public domain. So that also gave a lot of, trouble to the people's perceptions and all that. So there are a lot of confusion around. And in fact, it happened in US, it happened in India also. The data was not put in public domain, and many doubts were raised within the scientific community, which actually then also reached to public also. So I think media can play a very important role in that sense. It can, give as a vent or a space or a channel for public to directly participate in the process itself. Where they can actually have an access to the data, or where we can have representatives from civil society actually taking part in the scientific process itself, scientific research itself. So that can, I think, give a sort of credibility, or it can raise the trust which actually people put on scientific community. Regarding this media, again, coming back to the media, I think media, we can't just put it in a homogenized category, this, media, whole media, because there are different sorts of media. When you sit of ultra, at the top strata of the society, so media plays a very different role. And when you go to the ground level, grassroots level, I'm talking about Indian society, media has a very different role to play. So it's not just mainstream media which actually has to play a role. We have, indigenous media, we have regional media, we have folk media, which is very, very important as far as, current disinformation or misinformation is concerned. It's not just only, newspapers or TV channels, because a lot of people in the rural areas, they don't actually watch, they don't read newspapers at all. I think in that, folk media can play a very, very vital role, to, kind of sort of, to, those misunderstandings which are happening, to play that around, to kind of decrease them down. So in that sense, yeah, media is.
That makes sense. So since we are here, I actually had a question for Heidi before, like about public leaders, but I thought this actually takes us very well into this talk that I think Tarun and I are also were talking recently about this. So there is this background. So we seem to be agreeing that in some way the public should be participating in this deliberative process where we are coming up with certain recommendations, right? So on the background of this idea that the public should be involved in the deliberative process of how we come up, I wanted to ask a possible challenge, right? So on one hand, we have evidence that the public tends to get affected by rumors, right? Like the case of the girl convulsing after HPV that led to increased post-vaccine hospitalizations. So this hints at the ways in which the public could get, if I may, get swayed by the rumors. On the other hand, there is the talk of authentic relationship with the public and involving them in the process of deliberation, which requires that we look at the public as people who can sort of fight off these emotionally driven, untested assumptions. So how are we to perceive the public, given these both sides? Heidi, Tarun, Rayies, anyone who would like to take up this question? Is there?
Yeah, I'm happy to leap in here. I think that one piece that we've kind of been missing a bit in the conversation is the fact that science doesn't determine the policies. It's the politicians. And where things get lost and science bears the grudge of thinking science, keeps changing their minds. Well, we may be stable in the science, but politicians interpret it in different ways. They're weighing, their constituencies, they're weighing other things besides the specific policy that they may be considering, like we see just vaccines, or we see just, our recommendations for masks, or scientifically what makes sense from a lockdown perspective. But they've got a lot of different constituencies, from business to others, to the anti-everything protesters, and they need to weigh all these different factors. So what may look like the science is changing their mind, science may be totally consistent in some cases. It's not in everything. I absolutely, I think this track of talking about the uncertainty and the evolving science is really important. But I get frustrated sometimes by this science, public understanding of science, when actually it's really, a dynamic that if only science were in the decision seat, I think it would be a safer, healthier world, but we're not. And some leaders totally disregard science, others stand behind the science. So I think we need to think about the whole politics of it. And of course, media plays out in this. And I really appreciate remembering that there are multiple forms of media. And I mean, I think what's out there, certainly in the international press, is I think a disproportionate attention to social media, as if people don't talk to each other anymore. Or, well, it is hard to gather. That I agree, but it's not like the world is only living on social media. And I think that these different types of interaction are important. And so I guess that was the main thing. There was one other. Just on the other point I was thinking about when in the previous discussions was on this issue of can the public handle uncertainty? In fact, publics today, they can't handle definitive fact. They don't trust it. Take this, it's good for you. This is 100% true. They just don't believe it for a second. And they shouldn't, because vaccines are not 100% safe, for instance. And actually expressing and being honest about the uncertainty is much more credible and much more of a trust builder than acting like we have a definitive fact, particularly in the context of a pandemic. Thanks.
Yes, Tarun, please go forward.
I'm glad that Rayies brought up that point about democratization. I do think that's an important point. I think it's often when we talk about science communication, the idea we have in mind is, why do we need better science communication? Why do we need it so that people can make more informed decisions? That seems to be the basic assumption, right? That either that people are making, or people are resisting scientific advice or policy advice that is based on science, or there's policy making that is not paying attention to science, as Heidi pointed out, or people aren't making informed decisions in their everyday life. And so there's a kind of instrumental value to scientific information, to disseminating scientific information. But I think there's a deeper reason why we should value science communication, and that is because, look, science is, or it should be, central to how we structure our lives. And I think in many ways it is. In many ways it could be more central. It should be more central to the way we structure our lives. And given that, I think there's an important concern about democracy, which says that, look, if on the one hand you have this kind of epistemic authority, which is the scientific community or the scientific establishment or science in general, and it really needs to be an epistemic authority. I don't think we can feasibly imagine democratization to the extent where we're all doing science together, right? I think there's a reason why there's a community that does science, that goes through a certain kind of credentialing process, where there are institutions of peer review and so on. So there are good reasons for having that epistemic authority. But on the other hand, as many people have pointed out, there is something, I guess, worrisome about the idea of an epistemic authority, right? Especially in a democratic context, especially if that epistemic authority is now dictating large parts of how you live your life, and the assumption is just that you listen to what they're saying because they know what's good for you. And so here is where I think science communication becomes crucial. So I don't think the aim should be, okay, scientists need to make sure that the public understands everything that they're doing, because I think, again, that is something that it's extremely unrealistic hope. That there's very little likelihood that many people are going to understand all of science that's relevant. But what we do need, I think, just like, we have the idea that political authority needs to be legitimized, needs to be legitimate in some way. And its legitimation is connected to the idea of the authority being publicly justifiable. That you have to see the authority as justifiable in public argument, that the public is able to see why that authority exists. I think we should have a similar notion of epistemic authority, that epistemic authority needs to be publicly justifiable. Now, it can't be publicly justifiable by just transferring all of that knowledge to the public, because then, again, then you're in a situation of epistemic symmetry, which I think is unrealistic. But it can be justifiable if we focus science communication on the whole question of, look, why is it that this authority legitimately resides with this group of people or this community or this particular discipline, right? And so science communication as a task of trying to understand and convey the legitimacy of epistemic authority is, I think, a very central role for science communication in a democracy. And it's a role that's really underappreciated. It's not about just conveying the product of science. This is what science is telling us, but giving some sense, and this is a difficult task, but I think a task that is extremely important and valuable, giving some sense of why one should consider that authority, the epistemic authority, to be legitimate beyond just the fact that it's been drilled into us that science is reliable, right? So some notion of the reliability of science, why the notion of how evidence connects to conclusions, and a lot of what we've been talking about before, thinking about uncertainty, the role uncertainty plays in that science, has to do with this question of trying to get across an understanding of the epistemic process of science rather than just the product. That is important, I think, for this democratic idea of justifying the epistemic authority of science.
Okay. Is there anyone who would like to, as I do have a question to Tarun, and but is there any other panel speaker who would like to sort of talk about this, or I can go forward with the question as well? So, yes, please, Rayies, please.
I think I more or less agree with Tarun, whatever he's saying, that, rather than just communicating products of science, or scientific notion as an authoritarian view, but, epistemic science and as an epistemic, notion, as an epistemic, authority, as an episteme kind of, that's very important from science communication point of view or democratization point of view. I agree with that. But the problem here is, because currently most of the science communication which is happening around the world is actually or sadly, based on the notion of authoritarianism of science, that instrumental notion of science. And you can say that, I think more or less, if I may not be wrong if I say that that's a kind of a propaganda based science communication, because most of science communication world over is actually controlled by scientific institutions, and scientific institutions, they have a very particular view about what science is and what science isn't, and what actually is the role of public and et cetera, et cetera. So they have actually hegemonized this whole science communication processes. And I think what we need currently is very, very important for all of us to actually de-hegemonize that notion of science communication, to take out that science communication and to make it kind of more as Tarun said, give it a democratic image where we actually don't actually just communicate products of science, or just communicate science as an authoritarian view, or science as an absolute truth, but science as just a process, which can have uncertainty, which can have risks associated with it, and it may not be an absolute kind of thing. Yeah, that's very, very important. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to pick up on what Mike has also. Yes, please. Is there anyone? I think I just heard Heidi or Maya.
It was me. Yes. I wanted to add to that very good point that I think what you're suggesting here is that science communication should include how science and policy are connected within democratic institutions. It seems like that's the missing piece of the story. The first, that science is not a body of facts. Science is imbued with many values, and it impacts policy in different way. I mean, we don't get a clear picture of that when our leadership say things like, we are going to follow this science. Surely they did marketing research on that statement and decided that that is the thing that is going to give them the most public legitimacy, but it didn't say anything about what they were actually going to do. Which science? The science is contested. Our models tell us very different things. Some people said, we'll follow the science, and didn't follow it all. So we need a little bit more about how that science that needs to be properly communicated actually informs policy.
Right. Okay. So just to pick up on the point that had just recently been shared, I'm just going to pick up on what Mike has just shared. And I also agree. I think there's a bit of what Jamie has also shared, is that when Tarun is talking about the idea that we have to in some way communicate the epistemic authority of science to the public, that sounds like philosophy of science communication at one level. But apart from that, the fact that I feel like what we might be missing out on, I was wondering, is also the lived experience of getting a vaccine. So I feel like, which is also, I wanted to see the role of social scientists in this, because, so I'm going to get to, I think Heidi had talked about this in her book Stuck, right? So in your book Stuck, Heidi, you have talked about how it is not enough to tell people how well vaccines work against diseases. Right? Instead, researchers and public health professionals must look at vaccine experience, right? The whole process of having children, discussing vaccines with family and social circles, and choosing whether or not to immunize your child, or later in life receive, vaccines yourself. So maybe Heidi could, so just to add on to, what Tarun had shared, there's this aspect of sharing just information about science to the public, but there's also this side of experience. So Heidi, could you share how these differ a bit? What does it mean to simply share facts, and what would it mean to engage with the vaccine experience?
Well, I had a discussion about this yesterday with some colleagues in the system, as it were, and it was this. We had been doing a number of different discussions with people, interviews, whatever, and we had some interesting little video clips from people who said, no way, I sure am going to take that vaccine. No way I want that COVID. And somebody else saying, this may have its risk, but it's way better than that COVID stuff. And these were real people's candid, quick reactions, comments. When you hear that in a, 2-minute or 1-minute TikTok, that from a peer is going to have a lot more impact than some dry NHS take vaccines. They're much better than COVID for these reasons. That's one, it's about who's telling you, but virtually they're exactly the same thing, but where they're coming from, how they're said, and from a real person rather than a dry fact in blue ink on a white page, totally removed from any human reality, and also being from an authority. And you know how we all like authority these days. So I think that that's just a tangible example.
Right. Okay. So from what Heidi just shared about sharing scientific facts, so I think this is for Maya. I'm reminded of one of your papers, Maya. So in it, you had talked about questioning how we usually look at vaccine hesitancy. We usually see it as being rooted in public not understanding scientific facts, right? And you had shared that it is most probably due to mistrust. It is not a science versus ignorance, but it is a matter of trust versus mistrust. So Maya, how do you usually understand the relation between understanding science, experiencing science, say vaccine experience, and trusting scientists?
Oh, well, you can understand trust as underlying pretty much any relationship we have, including our relationships to institutions. So there's good philosophy of science research into epistemic dependence and epistemic trust, demonstrating that even scientists need to trust their colleagues in order to get work done. Now it's the norm to work in large collaborations. So there's just no way you can have one person checking all the facts and studying for themselves. So that's sort of the Enlightenment ideal of trust no one and study for yourself is just not feasible. Most of what we know in our everyday lives, and if we do scientific research, relies on trust in other people's as providers of information. So epistemic trust runs all the way through. It certainly is present in the way the public react to scientific information. So we are seeing around vaccines, which is my area of research, that there are communities that just don't trust scientific statements. They've got lived experiences and ideological commitments that says anything the NHS or the CDC says cannot be true, and I will, and they'll resist that. So that's where hearing information from a trusted source is going to make a difference. Sometimes that trusted source is whatever your friends are saying on WhatsApp. Sometimes it's celebrities or chat groups. And of course, that creates an ethical problem where the people that don't have good relationships with the institutional apparatus, they are stuck with these informational vacuums that they need to fill. And that's where the WhatsApp links start to come in. So the best thing we can do to sort of get vaccine messaging out there and to make it effective is to build trust with the people and communities that are not trusting, because otherwise it doesn't matter how many studies you show them, how you throw the facts at them, they're going to say, I don't trust the source. I have good reason not to trust the source. And therefore it doesn't matter if you've got 100 epidemiological studies or 1,000, they will not listen. And they are sometimes justified to be wary of it. So a lot of my work is building up this theory of trust. And I say, instead of looking at people as stupid for, let's say, not accepting the consensus on childhood vaccinations, which is quite strong, see where those, where that breakdown of trust happened and try to target that instead.
Right. I think Dr. A.P. Jayaraman has really sort of summed up a little bit of that very well. He says that content and process of science are blended in context, but credibility really depends on the science communicators. Apart from that, is there anyone on the panel who would like to share anything about what Maya has just said? Anyone who would like to share any comments? Yes, Tarun, please.
Yeah, I guess maybe this is more of a question to Maya. yeah, I think it seems very plausible to be thinking of this as mainly an issue of trust and how one builds trust. But I was wondering, I mean, it seems implausible, I guess, to me that trust building is, if it's not going to be by like communicating facts or like telling you that science is trustworthy or explaining how science is trustworthy, trust building is about, I mean, we place our trust often, even our epistemic trust, especially in our day-to-day lives, in kind of communities that we're familiar with, that we interact with on a regular basis. Right? It's not, so even our epistemic trust is often granted not for epistemic reasons. It's not epistemic reasons that drive our notion of who is epistemically trustworthy. Yeah. And I think this is a kind of fundamental problem, maybe, in science communication, is that science, insofar as science asks for public trust, it asks for it on the basis of epistemic reasons. And I mean, I'm not aware of the research on this, but it seems at least quite plausible that that is in fact very low on the list of the kind of mechanisms that actually lead people to trust authorities or distrust them. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
I think the point needs to be taken that people are seeking information. So let's agree that people need information. They'd like the information to be reliable. There is a general understanding that these sort of scientific institutions are supposed to be the most reliable sources. And the question is whether they actually accept it as such. So there has been social science research into, say, pediatric vaccine hesitancy. At least in industrialized nations, the person that is the most trusted is always the healthcare provider. So even people that have broad concerns about, let's say, the influence of big pharma on health research and health practice will still point to their healthcare practitioner as the most trusted source. So that says to me that the sort of relationship of experts to the public is not completely broken. The question is what happens from there. So there's this narrative that happens very often among vaccine hesitant, mainly mothers that have been that have written narratives or have been researched by social scientists where they say, I went to my healthcare provider with questions about vaccines for my baby, and I was shut down or made to feel stupid or something like that. So there you've got that communications breakdown, and that's when they start to seek information online and from friends and things like that. So it's not the case that the expert institutions were completely subverted. Instead, they had their opportunity and they lost it. So I still think there's more to it to say that the public understanding that who are the traditional sources still has some sway here. So I think the epistemic trust issue is telling us that more needs to be done to build and maintain those relationships. So I hope that answers your question, Tarun.
Well, it's Heidi here. I mean, I would throw in, sorry to interrupt, but I think I've been thinking a lot about this, as you say, that on the one hand, we have this broader environment of distrust in experts or not wanting to hear from, not trusting experts, certainly on their own, at the same time having high trust in healthcare professionals. But that's a relationship. And very few people in the public in general, I mean, science is like multiple steps away from most individuals in the public. Whereas the healthcare professional is someone you interact with, you have some tangible relationship with. So I think that that's something we should just throw in the picture. Is it distal or is it proximal? I mean, how far away are you from that source of knowledge?
Right. Rayies, would you like to add in? You had just, I think.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to trust, there's one more important actually thing which we should keep in mind, that sometimes what happens is, which actually happened in US context as well as in Indian context also, when opinions get associated with political ideologies, So that's a very big challenge. They're actually, I don't think that trust plays much of a role between science and public, because you see that when mob rationality or mob opinions get associated with conservative political ideologies, I don't understand, and it sometimes it confuses me, or maybe how to actually control, challenge it, how to address this problem. So this was actually a question for Maya. So this is some sort of a strange puzzle which actually many people around the world are thinking actually how to address this problem. It's a very important problem which actually currently we have in India is facing, and of course in US also. So yeah.
Sorry, Rayies, is the question, how do you engage communities that are not trusting of scientific information? Was that your question?
And yes, especially in the context when the opinions get associated with conservative political ideologies, and when those political ideologies actually are, as you said, that they disregard science. Most of times they disregard science. They won't take science at face value. Yeah. So in that situation, what would be the course of action?
Well, there has been some research where and sort of research on public health communications where you try to target the message and the ideology associated with it and break that down. So things like enlisting experts that might fit the profile of an ideological group can break down the aversion towards a certain view. So there's been work in cultural cognition is the area that does this. There was I remember reading about a research study where they knew that conservative Americans were more resistant to the HPV vaccine because of thoughts about sexuality and promiscuity. So they enlisted what they saw as experts that sort of fit the profile of what an expert would look like in this community. So it was usually a white man wearing a tie and sort of espouses conservative values, and get him to repeat the sort of information that we know about HPV. And they found a breakdown that when people are listening to people who they think share their values, they're more likely to be receptive to scientific information. And that is sort of a message about how we evaluate information, that it's not entirely the information itself, but it's also who's speaking it. So if you've decided that the CDC is not a trustworthy source, you don't want to hear it. But if you hear it from a religious leader or a standard conservative seeming expert, you will likely be more receptive to it, and they've had some good work around that. It's gone in the other direction too. I'm familiar with research that's taken place in Australia trying to target sort of left-leaning communities, natural living kind of hippie communities where they had very low vaccine uptake, and they provided narratives of people who shared their values, organic food, yoga, cloth diapers, and they vaccinate. So they broke down that association of the scientific claim, which has been politicized, and the associated values that go with it.
Okay. And so I think that Amor and Kolekla, I hope I'm saying your name right, have also shared quite good comments on chat, and our panel speakers can see it if they're interested. I thought that, from what Maya just shared, I thought that I could pick up, Heidi has also categorized, like Heidi in her book talks about these different kinds of misinformation that, into different types. And I think the most damaging was bad science, where people with medical credentials tend to fuel overblown or unfounded fears. So I thought I could ask Rayies, especially in the context of, this whole idea of this naive idea of how, science usually works. Overall, Rayies, have you seen any instances where people who have medical credentials have sort of tended to drive some unfounded fear in India, or maybe more broadly, how misinformation and expertise sort of get to tend related within Indian context?
Yeah, sorry. I think, yes, it actually happened especially during this pandemic. You would see a lot of, clinicians and a lot of infectious disease experts actually coming up, on television channels, and, allaying some fears which were actually, or myths, or maybe, misinformation, which actually was doing rounds on the internet. So yes, it actually happened. And in fact, it happened in US case also. Well, Anthony Fauci used to come repeatedly on various television channels, and he used to, I think he was one of the best communicators during the pandemic as far as US is concerned, because he was repeatedly actually putting it in a very simple language, okay, how it works and what we're going to do and why mask wearing is very, very important. I think in Indian context also, we have so many good doctors, right from AIMS, director Dr. Guleria, you must have seen him number of times on NDTV, on various channels, actually putting up. And in fact, with the good thing about India is people do believe experts. As if you see the Pew Research, which actually came just some time back, I think last year, India is among the foremost countries where actually people trust, public authorities, and they have a trust in public institutions of science. So we don't have that much of trust problem here, but yes, we have a problem which is the more all-pervasive problem here is misinformation and disinformation at grassroots level, which is actually has to do something with the politics of the kind of politics which is actually happening in the country and all that. So yeah, but more or less the trust issue, as far as trust is concerned, our public actually more or majority on a majoritarian basis, I think we actually don't have that problem. You won't see any channel actually, or any media stream or any print media actually putting this a whole community is actually boycotting this vaccine. So I don't think I have any at any point of time in recent times heard, though you will actually come across very few rare cases where maybe an individual or a family, but not on a very broader scale. Yeah, that's the kind of yes.
I think Tarun just raised hand. Tarun, please.
Yeah, I think this is another thing to think about. That's important. That on the one hand, we've been talking a lot about how science communication is about building trust in scientific expertise, in scientific institutions. But the flip side of that is it's not enough to build trust in them. As Rayies mentioned, there's already a fair amount of trust in scientific expertise in India. The problem is there's also trust in a lot of pseudoscientific expertise, not scientific expertise, right? And so along with building trust in scientific institutions, you also, an important task of science communication is also to kind of act as a watchdog or play or kind of dismantle the kind of messaging that leads to trust in these certain forms of alternative medicine that can lead people to avoid scientific medicine and things of that nature. And so here, we go back to, I was talking earlier about the idea that part of the role of science communication, an important role, maybe even the most important role, should be conveying something about why science has a kind of epistemic authority. What is it about science that has a kind of, that leads to a kind of epistemic authority? And I think one important aspect to convey here is that a lot of that is about the institutional structure of science, right? So thinking not just about arguments that sound good or the fact that people have certain credentials on the face of it, but the institutional structure of scientific research. The reason why one has disciplinary divisions, the reason why one has certain kinds of constraints on the kinds of products of science that are allowed out. I think getting across the idea that the legitimacy of science comes not only from the reliability of the knowledge it produces, but also the fact that the knowledge it keeps out, or the constraints it places on unreliable knowledge, right? And emphasizing that, I think, is a crucial part of science communication. And perhaps in India, more crucial than the trust-building part is the aspect of explaining why a certain kind of institutional structure underlying the claim that you're making is important. That it's not enough to have someone with certain credentials making arguments that sound compelling in order for that to be demanded.
Right. Would anyone on the panel like to comment on what Tarun has shared? Or, I can also pick up. Okay, right. So I think that this sort of takes us to Heidi's, talk about life cycle of a rumor and how that usually spreads, right? That's one of the aspects. So in October 2018, I think there was an article in Nature, where Heidi had talked about viral misinformation being the biggest pandemic risk. So you had written then that I predict that the next major outbreak, whether of a highly fatal strain of influenza or something else, will not be due to the lack of preventive technologies. Instead, emotional contagion, digitally enabled, could erode trust in vaccines so much as to render them moot. So could you tell us more about, Heidi, where you found, given all the points that have been recently shared, early signs of rumors in the current pandemic situation? How did you see them spread? Any instance that sort of stood out for you? You're mute, I think.
Picking up on the various pieces we've been talking about, if it were only the piece of information, but it's really, it gets dislocated, and people take, I just have a commentary coming out in American Journal of Public Health this month, and it's about how a piece of information about the mRNA vaccine, for instance, in some Moderna publicly available information, referred to it as how it was programming the system. And that absolutely lends itself to any anxieties about being reprogrammed, and the current rumors around, first they fed us GMO and now they're turning us into GMH, genetically modified humans. So it gets disconnected from the institution, from the different people along the way. But what to me is particularly fascinating about rumors is because the nature of rumors is about science. When you think about the very fundamental definition of a rumor, it's about a piece of yet unverified information. And I often say when I give talks on this is that rumors have a bad reputation, because actually they're very useful for science, particularly in the context of pandemic outbreaks. We're constantly listening for any kind of suggestion that there's a new outbreak somewhere. In Ebola, we relied on it a lot. In smallpox, when we were trying to finalize eradication, the bowels of WHO have smallpox rumor files that were we relied on them. But the challenge is when that evolving piece of information is confirmed, but people still believe what they believed before it was confirmed. The classic case is Wakefield and his vaccines cause autism. Despite, so much literature now, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cases of debunking, disconnecting that hypothesis that he had posed, because also science is about posing different hypotheses. And that it got so hardened in people's minds because it answered in a simple way a burning question in a lot of parents' minds. Why are we seeing more autism? Why are children having more autism? Why am I seeing it more? And we weren't, as a scientific community, and still today, giving a simple answer to that. So it's a bit of a tangent, but I do think if you look at this evolution from the initial hypothesis through to the actual verification or not, are all these externalities that determine its trajectory. And you can have the same beginning in 3 different settings, cultural or political, and they play out very differently.
Right. So I think I'd like to pick up
it more complicated.
Yeah, so I would like to pick up on that, on the complications, and ask Rayies that do you think people who share fake news or rumor, do you feel that they actually believe it? Like the intention of the spreaders, those who spread, might simply be you have said, to reveal the truth, which is different from the intention of the originators, those who start the life cycle of a scare or rumor, as a science communicator, right? How have you seen the life of a rumor or any fake news that you have come across roll out? What are the ways in which those who follow it, so to say, differ from those who begin the cycle? So you have said the political thing also, but what do you feel? What's your...
Yeah.
Well, I think this is where the evolution of mis versus disinformation has come up, to specifically distinguish the pieces of information that people unknowingly pass on to others because they think it's true, versus the disinformation, which is purposefully propagated for other reasons than spreading the truth, for disruption. And in a lot of the literature, it's primarily in psychology, distinguishes like the 2 main things that characterize trust. And one is, do you trust the capability, the ability of the individual or institution that the relationship is with? And do you trust the motive? And motive is a huge issue in the context of our discussion. And I think when it comes to motive, that's the biggest difference between the misinformation and the disinformation.
Okay, that's a very solid conceptual thing. Yes, Rayies, could you?
Yeah. I think I'll pick up from that actually point. I think as Maya has also actually put it, like there was an information overload during this pandemic, the rapidly evolving science actually, and it created a lot of rumors. And it was actually natural at that point of time, from communication point of view. And most of rumors actually were, false. They were actually fake or false news or falsehoods. And in fact, communication research has shown that, falsehoods spread, it was actually, the research was done by MIT, and it was actually published in Science, this research paper, very important and very, popular paper. And it actually proved that falsehoods spread faster, they spread deeper, they spread farther, and they spread broadly than the truths. It's very, very important actually. And this is what actually is happening, as far as COVID-19 is case is concerned. So it has actually its roots in negative bias, which is actually a kind of hypothesis, a theory in communications, which says that with equal intensity, things of negative nature have a greater effect on the psychological state than if it's truth. So now we have a condition here where actually if it's a falsehood or if it's false news, it has more potential to spread not only very rapidly but also go deeper. So in that sense, yes, because people, when it's a negative news, it actually stimulates your psyche. So yeah, you tend to believe in those kind of things. Now that's the main challenge before the researchers or scholars. You still have to be able to understand that how to actually address this problem, how to challenge this problem, or how to counter this problem. So yeah, in that case, I think it was natural. You had a lot of science which actually was going on, and rumors were happening around, and those rumors give actually rise to a lot of falsehoods, so which actually spread around.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would anyone like to comment on that? Or, I had this question that sort of wraps up all the different aspects that we have talked about. Okay, I'll just put it out. We have talked about values, how important values are, and how the importance of trust. We also talked about the epistemic authority of science and the important role of how we talk to the public about these different aspects. So in the Indian context, I wanted to see if I can sort of bundle all of these aspects up and talk about it in the context of how we have looked at indigenous traditions in this, and the danger that of sort of of closing the public off to the scientific facts and information in case we reject indigenous traditions. So the way in which our leaders sort of portray and accommodate native ways of doing things, say Ayurveda, and we have had many instances in their narrative of the crisis, deeply affects the extent to which the public listens and open up to their suggestions. So in India, during this pandemic, there has been quite a stir about Ayurvedic remedies for coronavirus. And at such times, it is almost a matter of patriotism and nationalism that we do not look down on native methods. And on one hand, there is the need to clarify and reveal the possible pseudoscientific nature of some of these native methods. But at the same time, there is the risk of losing public comfort. So in what ways can we sort of balance between these different factors? I had this question for Rayies, Maya, Heidi, and Tarun, like anyone who would like to take this up. And yes, Tarun, please.
Just frame the way you said it. I mean, so if the question is how should we be balancing the potential fact that these traditional methods or indigenous methods, how you want to describe the alternative medicine, isn't scientifically validated, but probably is it reliable? Maybe sometimes we even know that it's not. There's no scientific basis to it. And if the trade-off is against maybe somehow losing the public, the suggestion is that if we try to undermine those things and point to what is often called Western science, I guess, I think it's probably not the best way to frame it in this context, but if that would alienate some of the population. That was a suggestion that devaluing these methods would alienate them. I mean, I think, look, if the ultimate aim is public health, then I think having these like potentially ineffective remedies out there is a much greater threat to public health than any potential alienation that might be caused by people being turned off to science by messaging that seems to devalue those methodologies. But I do think the form of, so I do think there's something interesting. So when you talk about these methods as indigenous, I think that in itself is a kind of construction, right? Describing a lot of these things as indigenous is a kind of a construction. Now, it's true that Ayurveda, there is an ancient tradition in India, but a lot of what gets counted as Ayurvedic remedy right now isn't really just coming from that ancient tradition. Also, people often encompass things like homeopathy within this idea of indigenous medicine, and there's nothing indigenous about homeopathy. In fact, we have a ministry that treats Ayurveda and homeopathy as kind of equivalent when it comes to medicine. And so in some sense, this idea of an Indian medicine is a kind of a construct, right? This idea that this is, so there's a kind of nationalist political agenda that operates, I think, by constructing a kind of tradition or history that really doesn't reflect a kind of research tradition that has existed for any reasonable amount of time in our country, and claiming that this is Indian medicine. And I think the way to combat that is to point out that, look, the major advances by India in the field of public health and medicine that have been recognized not just within this country but outside this country haven't come from Ayurveda or homeopathy. They've come from scientific medicine, right? From India's contribution to scientific medicine. The fact that India has made great strides in pharmaceutical research, the fact that India is producing a lot of vaccines, which is unusual for a country as poor as ours. These are major achievements that we should be focusing on, and there are achievements that people highlight. But I mean, I think insofar as one wants to make sure that we are presenting science as not an alien phenomenon, but a phenomenon that people feel comfortable with thinking of as Indian, I think that's the way you want to go about it, is pointing out that a lot of actual scientific work is happening in India, not by pointing to this kind of constructed alternative medical tradition as being genuinely Indian science, and talking about actual science as Western science.
Yes, Maya, please go forward. I think you might be on mute.
The risk of even the way the question was framed is creating this idea that you need to pick one. So either you are nationalist and Ayurvedic supporting, or you support biomedicine. And so I think some of the gestures that Tarun was making was to try to say that you can actually have both. You can be Indian, you can be believing in our traditions, but you can also accept certain parts of biomedicine, which are now part of India's current landscape and even part of their history too. So, I'd say just as long as the language doesn't frame it as one or the other, but that you can have both, they can go very well. We don't have a similar question like that where I live in Canada, but we do have this effort to make, right now we do have a sort of clunky vaccine rollout happening, and they're trying to make it more appealing to groups that have bad feelings around biomedicine and healthcare institutions. So we've had some great success with Indigenous Canadians who are First Nations and very resistant to healthcare as a whole for good reasons. They've created their own First Nations vaccination clinics, and that includes same vaccines. So we're not competing between vaccines or treatments here, but it's being administered by First Nations communities. There's a certain religious and ceremonial acts being around it, like burning of sweetgrass and things like that, and that's creating an environment where you don't need to be us versus them, but you can actually recognize, these healthcare provisions as consistent with your own values.
Okay. I think Tarun had raised a hand before. Tarun, I just wanted to sort of put in this question. This is the final question I had before we open this for the discussion. But I wanted to actually just put, maybe Tarun can also answer to this while he makes his comment. This is the devil's advocate question, some question that I have come across many times while we have talked about this is, some might say that we are as experts trained in Eurocentric thought, right? So in extreme terms, we are putting it in within the context of decolonizing medicine. Let's say we are the colonizers or still colonized and are unfairly biased against the native method. So there is the need to also, in some way, people might connect the historical oppression of a certain kind of space with the kind of native method they come up with. So what do you feel about this perspective? In what way do you feel we could answer to someone who sort of raises this challenge without yet again closing the possibility of a healthy dialogue? So Tarun, you had raised hands, so please, I'm sorry, I just tipped in the question.
Yeah. So to answer that question, I think this is kind of this point gets made often, but I think one way to resist is to say that this is a basic misunderstanding of what colonialism is, right? What is the problem with colonialism? The colonialism is not a problem for some xenophobic reason that any influence from outside our boundaries is harmful, right? Colonialism was a specific kind of extractive political and economic regime, right? Where the purpose was to exploit the country economically. Now, the ideology that colonialism becomes associated with anything non-Indigenous, that any kind of influence of non-Indigenous ideas is an example of colonialism, is, I think, a very pernicious kind of idea. I think, and it's basically encourages a kind of xenophobic nationalism, the same kind of, nationalism which in the extreme led people to talk about things like a German science, as opposed to other forms of science or something like this, right? So I don't think, I think one response to that is to say that, no, this is not colonialism, that there might be certain kinds of notions that you can appropriately call the colonization of thought. I don't think the entry of modern medicine into this country qualifies as one of them, simply because a large part of the foundational ideas came from outside India. So that is what I'd like to say about that. Also, just going back briefly to the previous discussion, I think one point that I would like to make is that, so I had mentioned the idea of focusing more on the process of science rather than the product of science in science communication. And I think one of the pathologies that arises with a kind of almost fetishization of science as a set of technologies or products that can change the world versus thinking of science as an epistemic process is that you see a lot of fundamentally non-scientific approaches kind of taking on the trappings of science, claiming to be scientific. And so you see this with, for example, Patanjali claiming that they have approval from the WHO, which really that didn't happen in a meaningful sense. And so you kind of project this image of being scientific. And similarly, when you see a lot of the work being done in a lot of alternative medicine, it puts on certain trappings of science for an outward-facing purpose, to kind of project itself to the public as science. But the process itself is what we should be examining, not the fact that this comes bottled in a bottle that says WHO approval or whatever. When you have to think about what is the process through which this was developed. And I think science communication has a major role to play there in combating maybe the influence of some of these pseudoscientific ideas.
Great. Would anyone like to pitch in, and Rayies, Heidi, or Maya, anyone who would like to sort of comment on the question? Yes, Rayies.
Yeah, but Tarun, I think when you mentioned the role of science communication, I agree with you. Yes, there is a role of science communication, but as far as science communication is concerned, let me tell you about Indian context. It's completely hegemonized by the scientific institutions itself, scientific community itself. So the kind of science communication goes whatever scientific, community wants it in a way, kind of. So that's actually, the main challenge would be to de-hegemonize that, how to actually, make it as an independent, as an independent institution of science communication, where it looks, towards science, not from a very, authoritarian perspective or an absolutist perspective, but actually be a sort of a kind of a, a watcher. We watch, science itself, a kind of a, what keeps an eye on science, critical science communication. from that perspective. So I think the kind of science communication which we are indulging in, which most of scientific institutions are indulging in, we have the same problems. So they will never say, actually, they will never put anything which actually goes against them, or which actually challenges their view. So that's the main problem with science communication. And as far as mainstream media is concerned, mainstream media, they don't actually indulge in much of a very, very original science communication. It's whatever is happening, actually, whatever the most of science reporting in India happens on the basis of press notes, with press notes which are actually released by the scientific institutions itself. So this is a larger question, actually, yes, and we all should come together to think on how to actually de-hegemonize that from that sort of thing. So it can actually maybe come up with some sort of, solution in that direction.
Great. Would any of our panel speakers want to comment, or else I could give a short sort of recap of what we have done, and we can open this for discussion. So Tarun, Heidi, Maya, anyone would like to? Okay, so this is, I think we have covered so many different aspects of the situation. And I think so this is the end of the panel discussion. And I thought I could just, we started by talking about the realistic image of science, how there is a continuous change of scientific facts, and the idea that image of science as static. And we also looked at the classic missteps that are usually taken during science communication about vaccines to the public. Heidi had also mentioned about usually how public leaders are also important for this process, and best way of how we can deal with the doubtful public. And we have also looked at the deliberative processes of how the public might be involved when we are making recommendations. And we also looked at, I think, the relationship between experts and public, about the deliberative processes, viral misinformation. We have also looked at the life cycle of a rumor, the different kinds of misinformation we might come across. And I think we wrapped that up by talking about the misinformation or information about the indigenous traditions and our own role as experts in this during the pandemic situation. So that's the wrap up, short, quick wrap up for the panel discussion. I'm going to open this out to our audience right now, and the audience can raise their hand, or else you can put the question on the chat box. We actually, Heidi might have to leave us a little bit early in 10 to 15 minutes. So in case you have any questions specifically for Heidi, please feel free to ask now, and please feel free to put the questions into the chat box as well. And also you can raise your hand. So I think Mike just raised hand. Yes, please.
Yeah, just because Heidi might have to go. I live in London, so I hear tons about the SAGE stuff, and you've been on the SAGE working group, and I've never actually been this close to somebody who has been, and I would love to know what some of the challenges are in a place like that where you have direct contact between scientists and politicians. To what extent do they listen? How exactly do they work? Can you tell us anything about those?
Well, I can. This is a great example of the challenge of science. I'm actually not on the UK one. There's SAGE is the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts in Immunization for the World Health Organization, and that's what I've been on. In the UK, they have the SAGE that is kind of the Science Advisory Committee. And they have another term here that has a very different meaning than in the international forum. So I think it points to the risk of acronyms in science. But I can tell you that there are a lot of scientists frustrated with the SAGE process from the science end of things.
Thanks.
Okay.
Probably not much more than you knew, but anyway. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have Vlasta. Vlasta, please go forward. You're on mute, I think, right now. Yes, please.
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you so much. This was really great. I enjoyed the panel. I also enjoyed very much Sahana's questions, and I will maybe relate to her last question. So it's not about scientific colonialism, but it's more about scientific elitism. We now, during this pandemics, noticed that there is certain favorization of researchers or vaccines coming from certain countries. And we are also, of course, witnessing that science can be great in many different countries of the world, and that researchers are not responsible for politics or shouldn't be connected so much with it. And my question is, how can this be better communicated with the public? Because it seems that it's important that public globally accepts research from many different countries. So it's for anyone who would like to comment on that.
Would any of the panel speakers like to comment on that? Or else we could also come back to it. Yes, Tarun.
Yeah, I mean, I can take a stab at it. It's a extremely difficult question, and it's an important question. So yeah, so I do think that there is a serious problem in terms of inequity in access to a platform when it comes to science. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, I mean, there's many factors that make it the case that developing and less developed countries have less of an ability to get their scientific voices heard often because of the way publication works, the fact that often that English is the language that you focus on, the fact that there's a lot of internal problems having to do with institution building. And I do agree that one serious problem, so I discussed the idea of scientific colonialism earlier, but I do think there is a serious problem with the kind of global inequity in both the access to the benefits of science, which we're now seeing with vaccination, and also in the kind of voice scientists from various parts of the world have. I mean, I think how one goes about tackling it is a question that's above my pay grade. It seems like it's a lot of things need to be dealt with before one can really start thinking about leveling this inequity. I think one of the things that has helped, I mean, just from a very kind of local point of view, just thinking in my own context, is that one of the major issues is prior to the pandemic was simply a kind of lack of communication between, say, the scientific community in certain parts of the world and other parts of the world, because, say, major conferences happen in the Western world, and it's expensive for people to fly there, meet people, talk to people, collaborate with them. I think the idea that we do events like this that don't require that we can interact with people from different parts of the world without actually having to be physically present in the places in the parts of the world where the scientific establishment is most powerful. I think that's one maybe small potential improvement in people being able to get their voice heard in organizing collaborations more globally. But of course, this is a very, very small part of the problem. There's a lot more to tackle about this problem. I just wanted to mention that as one slight silver lining about this whole situation.
Okay, great. So you can raise, anyone else who wants to ask any questions related to this, any follow-up can also raise their hand. I have a few questions from the chats, which I thought I could put out to the panel. First was a very early one by Jamie too. I think it might apply to Heidi and Maya. It seems like the methods of science communication crucially depend on pre-established relationship between various social groups and perceived authority figures. Is there much that particular authority figures can do to win over, that was in quotes, people who aren't likely to trust them in the first place? So Heidi or Maya, anyone who'd like to talk about that?
I think we've talked a bit about this, and then I'll turn over to Maya, but very much, and I think this point has come up, that it's very much relational, and you know, out of context, these pieces of facts, who delivers them, how they deliver them, all of that is not separate from the credibility, the perceived credibility, I should say. But I'll turn over to Maya on that.
The quick answer is, if you want to be trusted by a community that doesn't trust you, is you need to demonstrate your trustworthiness. So there's two factors there. Is you actually need to be trustworthy, and you need to be recognized as such. So I think Jamie knows this, but in epistemology, we make that distinction between trustworthiness and credibility, with credibility being the perception of it. So in some cases, we don't know where things stand. Regarding vaccines, both COVID vaccines and pediatric vaccines prior to this. If you want to know what people don't trust about vaccines, you just have to ask them. And the messaging comes out, there's some uniformity in it. In the research that I'd looked at, and I looked at research in many countries, it was a perception that healthcare and health research has been co-opted by pharmaceutical industry and as they call it, big pharma and those kinds of interests. And as for why some communities, racialized and marginalized communities at times do not trust the system and now are most resistant to receiving a COVID vaccine, they will point to medical racism and historic and contemporary experiences, poor experiences in healthcare. So you need to fix that. If there's nothing like a pandemic to actually give you that sort of kick to start initiating structural change. I know it's lofty goals. Most people in power don't want to change these structures because they benefit from it. But if you want a lot of public buy-in for public health measures, you have to demonstrate it, your trustworthiness. In other words, you have to earn it and you have to maintain it. So that's how you fix it. It's a tall order for sure. And then there are how communications are done on the ground. We've spoken more about the sort of smaller things like getting people from communities that are mistrusting and getting them to be the local messengers. Now they're using the language of local ambassadors, and that can be, let's say, scientists or doctors or even community activists, religious leaders. There have been sort of grassroots efforts that I know of in Canada, and it's been largely successful. People want to hear the message. They want the information, but they're not going to listen unless it's coming from a source that they trust.
And the challenge becomes when the perception where people perceive trustworthiness in individuals and institutions that are not trustworthy. And that's when it gets complicated.
Yeah. Okay. I think in the context of talking about the relation between political positions and capacity to handle uncertainty, Vipul, Vivek, and I think Abhishek and Vipul were discussing this, and Vipul had asked, is there sort of, I think Rayies could also pick this up, and maybe Tarun also, is there any sort of evidence, like value survey or anything, that right-wing beliefs correlate positively with distrust in science in India? Is there any empirical evidence for that, or how do we usually come to, or maybe I think it could also be, I think there was also the talk about conservative. Is there any correlation between people who have conservative beliefs are less likely, or I think it is going to be correlate with distrust in science. So can we correlate conservative beliefs or right-wing beliefs with distrust in science?
I think
yes,
this
right.
Yeah, I think exactly. Yeah, there has been a survey, but India, as far as India is concerned, we don't actually do such kind of surveys here. But yeah, these surveys have been in other countries, and especially in US, they have been done, and there is a stark difference between Democrats and Republicans. But it was just recently with regard to pandemic, 84% of Democrats believe that this COVID-19 pandemic is a public health threat, whereas only 43% of Republicans believe so. So there was difference between political ideologies. There's a big difference. I think same you can, to some extent, you can actually superimpose that to in Indian context, although to some extent not exactly the same. But yes, as far as political ideology is concerned, yes, there are differences. And the more problematic thing is when the people who follow these political ideologies, they tend to actually follow the same belief systems. When actually Trump said that you don't need masks at all, so he threw a mask, actually, if you remember, in TV interview and all that, a lot of people actually started not wearing, they started unwearing the masks, and and in fact, if you would say that mask is very important, you used to say you are an anti-Trump kind of anti-government kind of things. So I think there is a direct relationship between the political ideologies and sort of the trust you pose into scientific authorities. Yes, because there's a certain cognitive bias which actually comes into play.
I would like to say that I don't think that's unique to conservative views. It is just we are living in a time where the mainstream science has been associated with left elitism. I'm thinking of the US context too, just because I'm more familiar with the research that's been done there. So left-leaning people misunderstand and misstate some areas of science too. So people on the left are far more resistant to genetically modified foods. So just because and I think the lesson there is that certain scientific claims have been tied to certain ideologies. I'd also read and saw an interesting study back to US attitudes about COVID along lines, whereas conservatives tend to understate the severity of COVID. People on the left were actually more likely to overstate it. So when they were asked things like how many people of this demographic is likely to die from COVID, they came up with wild answers. So it just shows how the science is polarized in a way that there's room for misinformation on both sides. So the task here is to break down the ideological connection to certain scientific views. There's other areas of science that are not so politically charged. So you'll find a pretty even balance in terms of conservative versus progressive views.
Tarun, yes, please.
Yeah. So I fully agree with what Maya just said, and I think it's when we talk about the correlation between sort of distrusted science and certain political beliefs. I think there's two different kinds of correlation we can think about. So one is the kind that Maya was just discussing, when science itself gets associated with a particular political ideology, often for contingent reasons. Then on that specific scientific topic, you're going to see people who are opposed to that political ideology kind of distrusting that science. And you see that with things like climate change and the pandemic on the right. You see that with things like genetically modified organisms on the left. But there's a distinct kind of mechanism that might be driving the correlation, which is that with certain kinds of ideologies, and this doesn't break down easily into just the right or the left, with certain kinds of ideologies, central to the ideology is postulating a different structure of epistemic authority than one in which science is our premier epistemic authority, at least when it comes to understanding the natural world. And I mean, some obvious examples of that would be like religious beliefs leading you to distrust science, right? There it isn't so much a matter of contingent political association that leads to the distrust with science. It's the idea that you think your ideology leads you to believe that there is a superior epistemic authority. And I think you also see that in a lot of Indian discussions about science coming from indigenous sources, or science coming from our traditional scriptures, and so on, right? As being more reliable somehow than modern science. That kind of traditionalism is a form of conservatism. Not all conservatism is traditionalism of that sort, but traditionalism is a form of conservatism. And so there is, I think, a correlation between that kind of traditionalism and the rejection of science that goes beyond just the contingent politicization of science that Maya was talking about.
Okay, so I'll have to quickly thank Heidi. Thank you so much, Heidi, for being here. And we're really grateful you could join us today. And we will continue with the panel discussion. We just have to say a quick bye to Heidi. Thank you so much. And I'll share the recording with you. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed the discussion. Bye.
Bye. Okay, so let's continue. I think Dr. AP Jayaraman has just shared a question. The zero prevalence rate is 10% and fatality rate is 0.4 in Kerala model of COVID containment. So is there any correlation with science communication activities? Anyone would like to say Rayies or Tarun, anyone or Maya? Is there a correlation between the zero prevalence rate and fatality rate?
Yes, I think very important point with Kerala model is because there this vernacular press is very, very strong in Kerala. So in Kerala, people have access to the Malayalam press and electronic media. And most of the science, they have a very strong and very old history of science communication. People's science movement and all that. So they have very strong science communication, which happens in the regional languages, so that common also people have access to the knowledge and information. So I think that's one of the important actually reasons that we have this kind of phenomenon is there in Kerala. I think that's one of the reasons. There might be other reasons also, but it's one of the important reasons which actually doesn't happen in other parts of India.
Okay. Anyone else would like to add anything? Yes, Tarun.
Yeah, I mean, so I fully agree with what Ray said, is that there is partly because of the high literacy and also because of the long history of the people science movement in Kerala and so on. The science communication environment in Kerala is a lot healthier than it is in many other parts of the country. Whether or not that is a significant explanatory factor in the low case fatality rate and low zero prevalence in Kerala, I think that is an open question. I mean, I'm not aware of any direct research saying that, and we should be careful of just saying that that is the reason. I think there's many other potential reasons why. I mean, Kerala also has much more developed public health sector than many other parts of the country and so on. So I think there's a kind of overdetermination of reasons why one might be seeing these positive results in Kerala. So yeah, I guess the answer to the question is just I don't think we know yet whether or not there's an explanatory relation between these two things.
Okay. So I have one question from Jamie. I think he asked it to Maya. Building trust seems to be a long-term project. So how can this be done speedily? It also seems like destroying newly established trusting relationship is relatively easy. So
you're right that it's easier to harm trust than to build it. That's a more long-term effort. I'd say in terms of what do we do right now, I'll name a few initiatives that have been happening right now and are going well. So one is outreach to communities that are currently not trusting, and trying to bring in the local ambassadors or local experts to try to do the communication. So where I live in Toronto, there's a Black scientist task force. They do webinars, they reach out to Black Canadians, and they don't shy away. I've attended some of the seminars, webinars, just to as a quiet listener, and they don't shy away from the sort of cultural context in which this comes in. So they are certainly experts by all means, doctors, scientists, nurses. They're there to answer questions and not to judge, but they always frame it within, yes, it's a difficult decision given our cultural history and our fraught relationship with healthcare. So they acknowledge that. And they seem to be getting good results. There's also a cross-Canada, South Asian COVID task force that is doing similar work. So the bringing in of local experts to actually reach out to communities, speaking to people who are recognizing their community situation, their values, making a language appropriate in cases of newer immigrant communities, that's gone a long way. It's not necessarily going to break down all those sources of mistrust, institutional mistrust, that you actually need to fix the institutions to do that. But at least the immediate task of getting reliable information about, in this case, it's about COVID vaccines, that's what we're struggling with now, to the communities that are resistant to hearing good information, that task has gone very, very well.
okay. There is a question by Vipul. So given these issues of trust and political partisanship, do we need to make a distinction between the factual task of science communication and political task of communication? So if yes, for the latter, that is political task of communication, should we also look for lessons more towards political communication than just science communication? So, Rayies, Tarun, or Maya, anyone who would like to take that up? Yes, sir.
I think so. I mean, I think there's many different ways in which one can think about the relationship between political communication and science communication. One of them is, I think, part of the problem that we've seen not just in India but in other parts of the world as well, with distrust developing about certain aspects of COVID science, is because of the way it has come down as policy, right? And I think just so I was talking earlier about the idea of establishing the legitimacy of epistemic authority and the importance of establishing the legitimacy of political authority as well. And both tasks are conjoined when you're talking about political decision-making that is ostensibly made on a scientific basis, right? That I think there's some responsibility there for political decision makers to convey the scientific basis for their decision making. I think that has been very lacking in a lot of the pandemic response in India, for example, that there have been decisions made where it's unclear whether there is a clear scientific basis to it. The scientific basis hasn't been clearly explained by the political authorities, unlike in the US, where the President Trump, whatever the other problems with it, held regular press conferences. There were no press conferences at all held about a COVID policy by our government here. And so that, I think, is unhealthy in two ways. It's unhealthy democratically, because there's a kind of authoritarian aspect to it, where the government is making decisions without explaining or justifying the basis for the decisions. And it's also unhealthy from the basis of trust building in science, right? I think it's a major mechanism by which trust in science is eroded, is when science seems to come packaged with this kind of authoritarian decision making. It's just something that's handed down from above, and you're told to follow the diktats of science without any clear sense of a commitment to conveying to you the reason underlying it, or why it is that, say, a particular pattern of lockdowns and so on is the right way to go about handling COVID. So yeah, I think it's an important problem.
Okay. Would anyone like to comment on that?
Yeah.
Right. Yes, please.
Yeah, and I think yes, because because when we talk about in STS field, we also always talk about science is also a political project. It's politicized science. There's a lot of politics actually which happens in the institution of science, in the ways as certain scientific research is done. So from that perspective, I think yes, science communication and political communication, I think they go hand in hand. We can't just divide these two and go separate ways. I think they can go hand in hand. And yes, as Tarun said, that science has to come up to the expectations of the people in a way that there should be a democratization, where it's not being thrust upon by the political class from the upper level. There should be a kind of bottom-up approach also. I think in that should go. The both can go hand in hand, because politics and science are very, very connected. We have seen that with the change in political regimes, there's a change in the way science is being done in the countries. In that sense, yeah, I think I agree with Tarun.
Okay, so Abhishek had a question for Tarun, I think, during the discussion. Does your suggestion assume, so I think it was when we were talking about epistemic trust and epistemic authority, so does your suggestion assume that epistemic trust is completely determined by epistemic factors?
So I'm not completely sure which particular suggestion Abhishek was referring to there. Abhishek is here, so maybe Abhishek, you want to?
You can also, yeah.
Yeah. I've been trying to find the raise hand button for quite some time. I'm terrible at this. No, you were suggesting that we should have an institutional framework in which not just the product of science, but also how do scientists come upon these, arrive at these conclusions. That also has to be disseminated. But subsequent discussion also kind of made this point that people choose to believe, or rather people believe in certain authorities, and these reasons are not only epistemic reasons. So that person could be from your community, or you might identify with, let's say, Ayurveda, because it's an indigenous form of knowledge production. It seems in such cases then that the reason why people take something to be authoritative in an epistemic sense is not exhausted only by epistemic reasons. So focusing only on, let's say, when we are talking about building trust in scientific communities, focusing only on epistemic reasons might not really solve the problem. That's what I was wondering.
Yeah. So I think this was along the lines of the question I had asked Maya earlier, that, it seems like when it comes to trust building, how much is epistemic trust built up for epistemic reasons? How much do epistemic reasons contribute to epistemic trust? And at least what I got from what Maya said is that, we shouldn't be completely pessimistic about this, that epistemic reasons do play a large role for a lot of people in building epistemic trust. I think it's quite plausible, and I'm in fact almost certain that they're not the only basis by which epistemic trust is built. There are other mechanisms that build epistemic trust as well. And I think insofar as but I mean, when it comes to science communication, so science communication, I think, is one part of what one can think of as broader scientific outreach, right? I mean, one could potentially, it's a semantic question, one could potentially label all kinds of scientific outreach as science communication, but science communication suggests a kind of discursive practice where you're trying to convey information of various kinds. So it is a kind of epistemic endeavor. And I think you're probably right that that is not going to be sufficient, although it might, I think it's a crucial aspect of what needs to be done. But there's other forms of scientific outreach that are necessary as well. I'm sure like Anganwadi workers, for example, when they go and talk to mothers about vaccination and so on, it's not just about, building epistemic trust by talking about the epistemic authority of science. It's also about building a relationship, getting a foothold in the community and so on. And so that is also an important aspect of scientific outreach. And I do think that absolutely should not be undervalued, discounted.
I'm just going to jump in quickly. I know you have more to say, but you're both sort of circling around the issue of expertise. Sort of who is the speaker is just as important, if not more important, than what is being said. So although the research on epistemic trust generally focuses on the extent to which we need to trust the informant. So who ends up being the trusted expert is crucial here. And the research in sociology of expertise is massive. Philosophy of expertise is sort of just new and starting. The findings include the fact that you trust people because you think they have the epistemic credentials, but the moral credibility is just as, if not more important. You have to trust them to be informed for sure, or at least be in a good position to find out, but you need to trust them to have goodwill or at least some kind of moral regard of you and your interests. They need to have your interests at heart. So you might have the best scientists, but they're not trusted because of whatever background relationship you have, while someone that you met on the internet, you might see, now there's someone who understands where I'm coming from. So that sort of second order assessment of experts is actually more crucial than the first order assessment of the information. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Okay. Okay. So I have one last question from Mike to Rayies. I think it is right. Like, in your experience, how important it is that the information that we communicate is beautiful or austere? How much thought goes into the aesthetics of science communication, and how tailored are the aesthetics to the different communities that are being targeted?
I think very, very important, they play a major role. In fact, if you see the disinformation campaigns which happen on Facebook or WhatsApp, you'll see all those messages. I have actually, analyzed a few of the messages which actually happen and, which come from the different communities around here through WhatsApp and Facebook. They're all very well, made, well framed, they're animation based, or they're actually, different colors are being put in it. Aesthetically, they're actually more, and they appeal to more to the common man, who doesn't actually apply the logic much and all those things. So those colors, they have an effect on when it comes to masses. It has a huge effect. The way you frame a message and the way the message, flyer goes, I think that has an impact. And it's communication theory also, as actually, proves, they have proved it. So yes, they have an impact on how actually it is being received by the audience, certain message. How you formulate a certain message, be it audio, video, or text. So that has a certain impact on the audience, mind or thinking. Yeah.
Okay.
I think they do certain impact.
Okay. So I think, yes, Tarun, please.
Yeah. Just to briefly add to that, this is more a kind of question, I guess, that I don't fully have an answer to. But when you think about the aesthetics of science communication, or how important framing is, and the simplicity of your message, say, or how well your message connects with certain common sense notions and so on. So on the one hand, people who are spreading misinformation often rely on this kind of aesthetics of communication. But I think a question facing science communicators is in actually spreading correct scientific information, trying to combat disinformation? How much do you rely, how much do you focus on framing, especially if it's the case that persuasive framing involves some degree of distortion of the truth, right? I mean, the ideal world would be one in which the most persuasive arguments are also the best arguments, but I doubt that that's the world we live in. That often, even in order to persuade people about true things and persuade people to ignore misinformation, you might want to have to frame your message in ways that simplifies things, maybe even misrepresents certain aspects of the science. One possibility that we discussed earlier, maybe this is counterproductive, is overemphasizing certainty. Other things are like picking out, sort of cherry picking data that you present in public to present a kind of picture of greater certainty than the actual data that exists produces. And I think this is a kind of moral conundrum facing science communicators, because on the one hand, there's a kind of arms race when it comes to the information environment, where you want to be able to confront misinformation or disinformation with the best, most persuasive tools you have available to yourself. On the other hand, if you see the purpose of science communication not just as getting people to believe the right things, but also conveying to people what science actually is, that involving people in this democratic exercise of deliberating together with this epistemic authority, then it seems like presenting a distorted view of science it kind of goes against that moral imperative. So I'm just presenting this as a problem. I'm not sure what the right response to this is, but it's something worth keeping in mind when it comes to science communication.
I think Mike had, Mike, did you want to actually add anything? I might have seen you.
Yeah, I think Tarun's comments are right on. Do we fight simplicity with complexity or simplicity with simplicity? And further, how much fire should you fight with fire? Do you fight trolls with more trolling and so on? I guess one thing I'm curious about is, as philosophers, it's really easy to think about these things from the armchair. I was wondering, Rayies, if you could sort of answer Tarun's question, how much thought actually goes into this on the ground in the science communication field? How much is dedicated to, for an article or for anything? How much thought it goes into the aesthetics?
I think a lot. As I actually mentioned about it, the biggest challenge about science communication messages is, their formulation, because when you compose a certain scientific message, which is based on a certain scientific research, because the first of all, you have to de-organize it, to simplify it, and simplifying to the extent, because as Tarun mentioned, I don't think I'll go to that level that way. Most of the time there's a distortion of the messages. I don't think that happens actually, but yes, it does happen. In the process, there are a lot of actually people around doing science communication who actually don't have certain backgrounds, or not enough skilled. So yeah, distortion happens, and there's misrepresentation of actual the research, whatever has been there, and yes, it does happen. And yes, the biggest challenge, as I told you, in science communication is how to put the message in a very layman friendly manner, and also not to distort what the actual message or actual research says. So yeah, it does happen in that sense.
Yeah. Thank you, Rayies. I think I'll have to, before I get to Shinod, I think Abhishek had a question. So Abhishek, if you could please share.
Yeah, thank you. So it seems to me that there is a kind of a fundamental tension between the need for people to find some sort of an authoritative figure and the uncertainty that is inherent in evolving science, whether it is COVID, climate science, or like even more fundamental areas of physics, though probably fundamental physics does not really affect people that much. So my question really is that given this tension, should we see the role of science communication in a slightly different manner? Instead of really aspiring to get all the population on board on the factually correct way of looking at the world, should we rather just look at or target populations where we might find some kind of, so for example, if there is a vaccine hesitancy in a particular subpopulation, could we just focus on that? So instead of communicating science to the population as a whole, could we limit it to some segments where we might find the possibility of science skepticism, that it leads to some greater issues, some greater problems. Anyone really?
Yes. I think the way any communication for the sake is done is actually you first keep or target audience in your mind. So before framing a certain message, you actually keep it who are the target audience, you specify them, and then according to that you actually frame a certain communication message. But yes, it's not happening in as far as science communication is concerned, because in science communication we don't currently have much experiments going on with where you customize for certain specific audience. We generally what we do is communication happens, it's for broad audience. You do it for national level, you do it for regional level, the same kind of thing goes into that. So we don't have that much of, and it should be, yeah, you're right, that we should actually take this into science communication itself. And I think that in that sense, it will make a big difference. Rather than actually focusing on the whole population itself, just focus on a certain specific audience, which actually other communication messages or communication initiatives they do. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yes, Tarun.
Yeah, so I'd like to go back to a point I had made earlier, which is that when you think about science communication, I think one reason why we need science communication is the kind of instrumental thing that I think Abhishek you're pointing to, which is that when there is actual pockets of distrust in science, which are leading people to say not get vaccinated, you cannot get the children vaccinated, things like this, then there's an instrumental value to communicating science to them to get them to make the right decision in some sense, right? And I do agree that that is an important part of what science communication is about. But like I said earlier, I don't think one should think of that as the main goal of science communication. I think science communication has a more fundamental democratic role to play, which is the idea that, look, in a genuinely democratic society, we want authority to be publicly justified. And that includes epistemic authority, not just political authority. And if that is the reason behind science communication, then it's not just about identifying pockets that need more scientific information. It's about engaging the populace in general in the deliberative process that science is, right? It's kind of accounting for the legitimacy of scientific authority to the population in general. So yeah, I think the idea of just restricting it to this kind of instrumental role is something we should avoid.
I think we have a question from, can I answer this question?
Yes,
a question from Mohan Pillai. Yeah, difference between science journalism in the West and India. Yes, Mohan, you're right. Actually, there's a difference between science journalism, which happens in the West, and this kind of science journalism, which happens in India. Because we still have not differentiated the terms between science communication and science journalism. So here it's actually mostly, even in science journalism, it's science communication going on. So you don't have those reviews which you actually were talking about which happens in the West, or there is no such sort of critical science journalism which is currently which is happening in India. So there's no such thing as critical science journalism or critical review of science as far as science is concerned, because there are a lot of other problems within Indian science. Not much opening up, so they're not very open to for press and all that. So this problem comes that. And yes, and I think the next step which some of us are trying to do is to have that sort of science journalism in India, where we can have a kind of where science journalism not only plays role of a, it also plays role of a watchdog. It actually reviews what the kind of science which happens within the scientific establishment. Yeah. So yeah, coming to your question.
Okay. Shinod, yes. Wait. Yes, now I think.
Okay. Thank you primarily for a fascinating discussion. So I have two quick questions. One partly stems from Tarun's point. So I'm mostly in agreement with him. So this comes from that. So that the science communication aspect seem to be we seem to have an agreement on two aspects. One, it has to be communicated in an appealing manner, aesthetically and otherwise morally. Other is, I'm not very sure the second part, the communication should happen in a way that do not radically disrupt so the natives or whomsoever's belief system. But this may work in the case of, say, if you're communicating a general theory of relativity sometimes. But this may not work in the case of something like evolutionary theory. Because any attempt to downplay the consequences, metaphysical and other consequences of accepting a general theory of, an evolutionary theory is in a way harming the content of that biological science itself. So how much we can rely on a trust building process by downplaying such underpinnings of a scientific theory, because such a trust built in such a way, we may lose it sooner, because down the line, science will reveal that we have communicated a wrong idea. That's one question. Second is Sahana's the important last question regarding the indigenous or local knowledge systems. I'm skeptical about that, because how much constructivism has gone into that aspect, constructing this local, because the Ayurveda has gone through enormous amount of modernization in India, and most Ayurvedic companies use now have massive protection, and they also have gone through large amount of assimilation of different local practices into a standardized Ayurvedic form. So how much constructivism has gone through this local ways of the global narrative? Thank you.
So anyone who would like to take up that question? Tarun, Rayies, or Maya? Anyone like to share their views on that? Yes.
Yeah, so I can in response to the first question that Shinod asked, so I think I'm broadly in agreement that, look, what I understand the question to be is that while as a strategic matter, when we're attempting to disseminate science, it might be advisable to, as far as possible, make sure that it doesn't challenge kind of deeply held beliefs that people have, because that's going to affect scientific trust, that's going to affect the dissemination of that message. But if that involves significant distortions of the science, sort of presenting the science that as it is would actually undermine certain deeply held beliefs, and for that reason we distort the science, I think there's something deeply patronizing about that approach. Whether or not it would be strategically better to do that, I don't know. That's a very good question. But I think I agree with Shinod that at least for certain kinds of science communication, we have to confront the fact that there might be fundamental contradictions between basic beliefs people have about the way they live their lives and what science is telling us. And in that context, I think we should trust people's epistemic capacities enough not to try to sugarcoat the science to them and present it to them. On the other question about Ayurveda, again, yeah, I fully agree with that. And I also think that we should be deeply suspicious of the whole notion of an indigenous tradition as opposed to a non-indigenous tradition. I think the whole concept of indigenous is problematic in many ways. For one reason being, as Shinod said, it's not like the indigenous tradition, the way it's practiced now, is the same as it was practiced when Ayurveda was first created. It's now, you have modernized production processes. It's taken on a lot of the trappings, at least, of modern science, although maybe not some of the evidentiary requirements. And the other reason is that I think from a political perspective, this idea of some privileged tradition being essentially Indian ignores, or essentially whatever, depending on wherever you are, I think ignores the kind of multicultural character of this country, the fact that, when we think about that one thing that we want to avoid in a multicultural nation of the kind we live in is classifying knowledge traditions based on their geographical point of origin and treating that as an epistemically relevant criteria. So I think there's something fundamentally problematic about the whole notion of indigenous, the way it's applied to knowledge traditions.
Okay. Anyone else would like to comment anything about that? Okay. Okay. So this brings an end to our third session of Eth.Sci, and I want to give a quick thank you note. Huge thanks to Heidi Larson Maya Goldenberg, Rayies Altaf, and Tarun Menon for joining us today, for engaging with the questions. And we want to thank our audience the most for reaching out, for being here and sharing their views. And the series of symposia has been organized by Eth.Sci India Group, the Wise Zacher Center at the University of Tübingen, the Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Geneva, and the Forum for Advancing Science and Education Through Philosophy. A huge shout out to all our co-organizers, Abhishek Kashyap, Dawn De Cruz, Jamie Shaw, Tarun Menon, Shinod, and Vlasta Svikmik. So thank you so much, guys, and I hope to see you all soon later. Take care.
Thanks a lot, Sahana.
Thank you, Sahana.